In 2004, 12 middle school students boarded a yellow bus for what should have been a routine field trip to the Natural History Museum. By sunset, the bus had vanished without a trace. No crash site, no ransom demands, no bodies. Just gone. For 17 years, the case haunted investigators and families alike, becoming one of the most baffling disappearances in modern history. But in 2021, a construction crew breaking ground on a new shopping center made a discovery that would turn everything we thought we knew about that day completely upside down. Before we dive into this twisted mystery, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like this one don't stay buried forever, and when the truth finally surfaces, you'll want to be here for it. The morning of October 15, 2004, started like any other at Riverside Middle School in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Students shuffled through hallways cluttered with Halloween decorations, their voices echoing off lockers as they discussed weekend plans and complained about upcoming tests. Mrs. Patricia Henley, a beloved 7th grade science teacher with 23 years of experience, gathered her students near the main entrance. She held a clipboard in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other, checking names off her list as kids climbed aboard the waiting school bus. The field trip had been planned for months. The Natural History Museum in Des Moines was hosting a special exhibition on prehistoric life, and Mrs. Henley had secured permission for her advanced science class to attend. These weren't just any students, these were the brightest kids in the school. Honor roll students, science fair winners, the kind of children who asked questions that made teachers think twice about their answers. At exactly 8:47 a.m., according to the school's security footage, Bus 47 pulled away from Riverside Middle School. The driver, Carl Morrison, was a veteran with 15 years of clean driving records. He'd made this exact route to Des Moines dozens of times before. The weather was clear, the roads were dry, and the forecast called for sunshine all day. Everything about that morning screamed routine, but routine has a way of shattering when you least expect it. The first sign something was wrong came at 11:30 a.m. The museum's education coordinator, Janet Walsh, called Riverside Middle School to ask about the delayed arrival. The field trip group was scheduled to begin their tour at 10:30, but they were nowhere to be found. The school secretary, assuming traffic or a brief stop, assured Walsh that the bus would arrive soon. They'd call if there were any major delays. By noon, concern had shifted to worry. By 1 p.m., worry had become panic. At 1:47 p.m., exactly 5 hours after Bus 47 had departed, Riverside Middle School contacted the Iowa State Police. The bus carrying 12 students and 1 teacher had simply vanished somewhere along the 127-mile route between Cedar Falls and Des Moines. The immediate response was swift and massive. State troopers, local police departments, and volunteer search teams flooded the highways. Helicopters swept the route from above, while ground crews examined every rest stop, every side road, every possible place a school bus might have pulled over or crashed. The Iowa Department of Transportation pulled traffic camera footage from every intersection along the route. Emergency services monitored radio frequencies for any distress calls. But here's where the story takes its first disturbing turn. The traffic cameras showed Bus 47 traveling normally for the first hour of the journey. Camera after camera captured the familiar yellow vehicle moving steadily south on Highway 218. Then, at 9:52 a.m., just outside the small town of Vinton, Iowa, the bus passed beneath a traffic camera for the last time. After that intersection, it was as if Bus 47 had driven into a void. The search intensified. Bloodhounds were brought in to track scents. Dive teams searched every pond, creek, and drainage ditch within a 50-mile radius. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing federal resources and expertise in child abduction cases. Missing person flyers with 13 faces, 12 young students and their teacher, appeared on every telephone pole and store window across 3 counties. What made the disappearance even more baffling was the complete absence of debris. When vehicles crash, they leave traces: broken glass, twisted metal, skid marks, scattered belongings. But investigators found nothing. No pieces of yellow school bus paint scraped against guardrails, no tire tracks leading off the highway, no signs of struggle or forced entry anywhere along the route. The families of the missing students were thrust into every parent's worst nightmare. The Hendersons, whose daughter Sarah was known for her infectious laugh and love of astronomy. The Kowalskis, whose son Michael had dreams of becoming a marine biologist. The Patels, whose daughter Priya was already taking high school-level mathematics. 12 families, each clinging to hope while battling the growing dread that their children might never come home. Media attention exploded across the region. The story of the vanished school bus dominated local news, then regional networks, and finally caught the attention of national media outlets. Nancy Grace covered the case extensively. America's Most Wanted featured the disappearance in a special episode. The families made tearful pleas on camera, begging for any information, any clue that might lead to their children's return. Theories multiplied like shadows in the growing darkness of the investigation. Some suggested the bus had been hijacked by human traffickers. Others proposed that Carl Morrison, the driver, had suffered a medical emergency and crashed in a location so remote that searchers hadn't found it yet. The most disturbing theory suggested that someone had deliberately targeted the bus, perhaps a disgruntled former employee or someone with a grudge against the school system. Investigators interviewed everyone who had contact with the missing group. School administrators, fellow teachers, maintenance staff, cafeteria workers, even the crossing guard who had waved goodbye to Bus 47 that morning. They scrutinized Carl Morrison's background, his finances, his personal relationships. They found nothing suspicious. He was a quiet man who lived alone, paid his bills on time, and had never received so much as a speeding ticket. The search expanded beyond Iowa's borders. Authorities in neighboring states were alerted. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team coordinated with local agencies across the Midwest. Amber Alerts were issued. The faces of 13 missing people stared back from billboards, milk cartons, and evening news broadcasts. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks stretched into months, the intensive search efforts began to scale back. The media moved on to other stories. The reward fund, which had grown to over $200,000 through community donations, remained unclaimed. The families continued their own private searches, hiring private investigators and psychics, following up on every tip and rumor, no matter how far-fetched. The first anniversary of the disappearance brought renewed media attention, but no new leads. The second anniversary saw a candlelight vigil attended by hundreds of community members. By the third anniversary, the gatherings had grown smaller, the media coverage more sparse. The case, once the most talked-about mystery in Iowa, began to fade from public consciousness. But the families never stopped searching. They never stopped hoping. They never stopped believing that somewhere, somehow, their children were still alive and waiting to be found. The investigation officially remained open, but resources had been redirected to more recent cases. The evidence room at the Iowa State Police headquarters contained boxes of witness statements, photographs, and forensic reports that had yielded no answers. The case file for Bus 47 had grown to over 3,000 pages, documenting every lead, every theory, every dead end. Detective Sarah Chen, who had been assigned to the case from the beginning, never gave up. Even as she worked on other investigations, she would return to the Bus 47 files during quiet moments, rereading witness statements, studying maps, hoping to spot something that previous investigators had missed. She attended every anniversary vigil, spoke with the families regularly, and followed up on tips that still trickled in from across the country. The missing students would have graduated high school in 2009. They would have gone to college, started careers, maybe gotten married and had children of their own. Instead, their school photos remained frozen in time, showing 12 bright young faces that had vanished into thin air on a sunny October morning. The case had become a cautionary tale told in driver's education classes and safety seminars. It had inspired new protocols for school field trips, including GPS tracking devices on all buses and mandatory check-in procedures every hour. But none of these measures could bring back the 13 people who had disappeared without a trace. Local urban legends grew around the disappearance. Some claimed the bus had driven into a portal to another dimension. Others whispered about government cover-ups and secret experiments. The more rational explanations, human trafficking or a catastrophic accident in a remote location, seemed almost as unlikely given the complete absence of evidence. Then, on a cold morning in March 2021, everything changed. The construction crew had been working on the new Cedar Falls shopping plaza for 6 weeks when their excavator hit something that shouldn't have been there. It was 6:23 a.m. on March 12, 2021, and the crew was digging the foundation for what would become the food court when the massive machine's bucket scraped against something metallic buried 15 feet underground. At first, the foreman thought it was an old septic tank or maybe some forgotten infrastructure from decades past. But as they carefully excavated around the object, the distinctive yellow paint became visible through the dirt and debris. What they had found was impossible, yet undeniable. It was Bus 47. The construction site was immediately sealed off. Within hours, the Iowa State Police had cordoned off the entire area with yellow tape and called in forensic specialists. Detective Sarah Chen, now 17 years older but still haunted by the case, arrived at the scene with her heart pounding in her chest. The bus that had vanished without a trace in 2004 was sitting in a hole in the ground, exactly where it had no business being. The location itself was deeply disturbing. The construction site was only 12 miles from Riverside Middle School, nowhere near the route to Des Moines. How had a 40-foot school bus ended up buried in what had been an empty field 17 years ago? More importantly, how had it gotten there without anyone noticing? The excavation process was painstaking. Forensic archaeologists worked alongside crime scene investigators, treating the site like an ancient burial ground. Every inch of soil was sifted, every piece of debris cataloged and photographed. The bus itself was in remarkable condition, preserved by the thick clay soil that had entombed it. The familiar yellow paint was still visible, though faded and streaked with rust. The numbers 47 were still legible on the side. But the most chilling discovery came when investigators finally gained access to the bus's interior. The seats were still there, arranged exactly as they should be. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the vehicle. A pink backpack with Sarah Henderson's name still clearly visible on the ID tag. Michael Kowalski's astronomy textbook, bookmarked at a chapter about black holes. Priya Patel's calculator, still functional after 17 years underground. What they didn't find was more disturbing than what they did. There were no human remains. No bones, no clothing, no signs that anyone had ever been injured inside the bus. The vehicle looked as if its passengers had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only their belongings as proof they had ever existed. The driver's seat showed no signs of struggle. Carl Morrison's thermos was still in the cup holder, half full of coffee that had long since evaporated. His clipboard with the day's route information was wedged between the seat and the door. The pages yellowed but still readable. Everything suggested a normal trip interrupted by something extraordinary. Forensic teams processed the scene for weeks. They found fingerprints belonging to the missing students and their teacher, exactly as expected. They found DNA evidence that confirmed the identities of all 13 missing people. But they found no evidence of violence, no signs of struggle, no indication of what had happened to make 13 human beings disappear while leaving their belongings behind. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. How does a school bus get buried 15 feet underground without anyone noticing? Heavy machinery would have been required to dig such a massive hole. The burial would have taken hours, possibly days. Yet no one in the area remembered seeing any unusual construction activity in 2004. Property records showed that the land had been owned by the Brennan family since 1967. Thomas Brennan, now in his 70s, insisted that nothing unusual had ever happened on his property. He'd used the field for growing corn until his retirement in 2010, when he'd sold it to developers. He swore that no one had ever asked permission to dig on his land, and he certainly hadn't buried a school bus there himself. The timeline made no sense. Traffic cameras had shown Bus 47 traveling south toward Des Moines at 9:52 a.m. The burial site was northwest of the school, in the opposite direction. For the bus to have ended up buried in Brennan's Field, it would have had to turn around and travel back toward Cedar Falls, then somehow disappear into the ground without leaving any trace of the excavation. Investigators began re-examining every piece of evidence from the original investigation. They interviewed the Brennan family again, this time focusing on what they might have observed in the days and weeks following the disappearance. They pulled satellite imagery from 2004, looking for any signs of ground disturbance that might have been missed 17 years earlier. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mary Brennan, Thomas's wife, mentioned during her second interview that she remembered the family dog acting strangely in the weeks after the bus disappeared. Rex, their German shepherd, had been obsessed with a particular section of the cornfield, barking at it constantly and refusing to leave the area alone. The family had assumed he was chasing rabbits or reacting to some other animal activity. When investigators compared Mary's description of Rex's behavior with the exact location where the bus had been found, they matched perfectly. The dog had been barking at the burial site for weeks, trying to alert his family to something buried beneath their feet. This revelation led to a disturbing new theory. What if the bus hadn't been buried immediately after the disappearance? What if it had been hidden somewhere else first, then moved to the field weeks or months later when the initial search had died down? This would explain why the dog had reacted weeks after the disappearance, and why no one had noticed the burial operation during the height of the investigation. But this theory created its own problems. Moving a 40-foot school bus requires specialized equipment and expertise. The burial site was accessible only through a narrow farm road that would have made transporting heavy machinery difficult. Someone would have needed detailed knowledge of the area, access to excavation equipment, and the ability to work undetected for an extended period. The investigation took another strange turn when forensic accountants began examining the financial records of everyone connected to the case. They were looking for large cash transactions, equipment rentals, or any other financial evidence that might point to who had orchestrated the burial. What they found was a series of anonymous cash payments made to Midwest Heavy Equipment Rentals in the months following the disappearance. Someone had rented an excavator, a dump truck, and other heavy machinery using false identification and paying entirely in cash. The rental company's records showed the equipment had been returned clean and undamaged, with no indication of what it had been used for. The timing of these rentals was particularly suspicious. The equipment had been checked out during a 2-week period in late November 2004, exactly when the initial search efforts had been scaled back and media attention had begun to fade. Whoever had buried the bus had waited for the perfect moment when they could work without being observed. Security footage from the rental company had been destroyed years earlier as part of routine record-keeping practices, but investigators were able to interview employees who had worked there in 2004. One mechanic remembered the unusual customer who had paid cash for the equipment rental. He described a middle-aged man who had seemed nervous and had insisted on handling all the paperwork himself, refusing offers of help or delivery service. The mechanic's description was detailed enough for investigators to work with a sketch artist, but the resulting composite image didn't match anyone in their database of suspects or persons of interest. It was as if the man had appeared from nowhere, rented the equipment needed to bury a school bus, and then vanished back into obscurity. Meanwhile, the forensic examination of the bus itself was revealing new mysteries. The vehicle's engine showed signs of having been running when it was buried. Oil levels were normal, the gas tank was nearly full, and there were no mechanical problems that would have prevented the bus from continuing its journey. This suggested that whatever had happened to the passengers had occurred suddenly, without warning. Even more puzzling was the discovery of a cell phone that didn't belong to any of the missing people. The device was wedged beneath one of the seats, its battery long dead, but its memory card still intact. When investigators finally accessed the phone's contents, they found photos and text messages that would change everything they thought they knew about the case. The photos showed the interior of the bus, but they had been taken after the disappearance. The timestamps indicated they were captured several days after October 15, 2004. But that was impossible. The bus had been buried, sealed away from the world. How could someone have been inside taking pictures? The text messages were even more disturbing. They appeared to be communications between the phone's owner and an unknown contact, discussing the logistics of what they called the project. The messages referenced specific details about the missing students, information that had never been released to the public. One message, dated 3 days after the disappearance, simply read, "The cargo has been secured, proceeding to Phase 2 as planned." Another message, sent a week later, was even more chilling. "Subjects are adapting well to the new environment. Documentation is proceeding as scheduled. The families will never find them where they are now." The final message in the thread was time-stamped November 28, 2004, exactly matching the time frame when the heavy equipment had been rented. Phase 3 complete. The evidence is now permanently secured. Project concluded successfully. Detective Chen stared at the phone's screen, her hands trembling slightly as she scrolled through the messages. After 17 years of dead ends and false leads, they finally had proof that the disappearance had been planned, coordinated, and executed by someone with access to resources and detailed knowledge of police procedures. This wasn't a random crime or a tragic accident. It was a carefully orchestrated operation. The phone's contact list contained only 3 numbers. 2 were disconnected burner phones that investigators traced to an electronics store in Chicago, purchased with cash 2 weeks before the disappearance. The 3rd number, however, was still active. When they traced it, the results sent shockwaves through the investigation team. The number belonged to Dr. Marcus Webb, a child psychologist who had worked with the Cedar Falls School District from 2003 to 2005. Webb had been interviewed during the original investigation as part of the routine questioning of all school personnel, but he had been quickly cleared of suspicion. He had a solid alibi for the morning of the disappearance, having been conducting therapy sessions at his private practice with multiple witnesses confirming his presence. But the phone records painted a different picture. Webb's number appeared dozens of times in the mysterious phone's call log, with conversations occurring both before and after the disappearance. The pattern suggested ongoing coordination between Webb and whoever had been taking photos inside the buried bus. When investigators arrived at Webb's office to question him again, they found it empty. The building's landlord explained that Webb had abruptly terminated his lease 3 months earlier, claiming he was relocating to another state. He had left no forwarding address and had taken all his files with him. The timing was suspicious, coming just weeks before the construction crew had discovered the bus. A deeper investigation into Webb's background revealed disturbing inconsistencies. His credentials, which had appeared legitimate in 2004, were actually based on a degree from a diploma mill that had been shut down for fraud. His supposed previous work experience at a children's hospital in Minnesota had been fabricated. The man who had been trusted with the psychological well-being of dozens of children in Cedar Falls had been operating under a completely false identity. The revelation that Webb was involved sent investigators scrambling to re-examine his interactions with the missing students. School records showed that he had conducted individual counseling sessions with 8 of the 12 missing children in the months leading up to the disappearance. The sessions had been routine psychological evaluations, part of the gifted student program that all the missing children had been enrolled in. But former colleagues began to remember strange details about Webb's behavior. The school nurse recalled that he had been particularly interested in the field trip to the Natural History Museum, asking detailed questions about the departure time, the route, and which students would be attending. The principal remembered Webb volunteering to help with permission slips and emergency contact information, tasks that were unusual for someone in his position. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that Webb had requested copies of all the missing students' academic records, psychological profiles, and family information just 2 weeks before the disappearance. He had claimed he was conducting a research study on gifted children, but no such study had ever been approved by the school board or any academic institution. The investigation team realized they were dealing with something far more sinister than a simple kidnapping. Webb hadn't just taken the children, he had selected them. The missing students weren't random victims, they were specifically chosen targets who met some criteria that Webb had been looking for. A forensic analysis of Webb's office computer, which had been left behind when he fled, revealed partially deleted files that painted a horrifying picture. Webb had been monitoring the academic performance, psychological profiles, and family situations of dozens of students across multiple school districts. He had created detailed dossiers on each child, ranking them according to unknown criteria. The 12 missing students had all been marked with red flags in Webb's system. Next to each of their names was a notation: primary candidate, exceptional cognitive abilities, minimal family supervision, high adaptability potential. It was as if he had been shopping for children with specific characteristics. But adaptability for what? The deleted files contained references to something called Project Renaissance, but most of the details had been successfully erased from the computer's hard drive. What investigators could piece together suggested that Webb had been working with others, possibly part of a larger organization with resources and connections that extended far beyond Cedar Falls. The discovery of Webb's involvement also explained how the bus had ended up buried in such a remote location. As a school district employee, he would have had access to transportation schedules, route information, and detailed knowledge of the area surrounding Cedar Falls. He could have easily directed the bus to the burial site without arousing suspicion from the driver or students. But Webb couldn't have executed the plan alone. Burying a 40-foot school bus requires multiple people, heavy equipment, and precise timing. The investigation team began looking for his accomplices, focusing on anyone who might have had access to the rental equipment and the expertise to carry out such an elaborate operation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A former employee at Midwest Heavy Equipment Rentals came forward after seeing Webb's photo in news reports about the case. The employee, now retired, remembered the nervous man who had rented the excavation equipment in November 2004. But more importantly, he remembered that the man hadn't been alone. According to the witness, Webb had been accompanied by 2 other men during the equipment rental. One was described as tall and thin with graying hair, possibly in his 50s. The other was younger, stockier, with distinctive tattoos on his forearms. Both men had stayed in the background while Webb handled the paperwork, but the witness had noticed them examining the equipment carefully, as if they were familiar with operating heavy machinery. The witness's description of the tattooed man matched perfectly with someone already in the investigation files. Danny Kruger was a former construction worker who had been questioned in 2004 after witnesses reported seeing him near the school on the morning of the disappearance. At the time, he had claimed he was looking for work and had been quickly dismissed as a suspect. But a deeper look at Kruger's background revealed connections that investigators had missed 17 years earlier. He had worked for several construction companies in the Cedar Falls area, giving him access to heavy equipment and knowledge of remote locations suitable for large-scale excavation projects. More importantly, he had been treated by Dr. Webb for alcohol addiction in 2003, establishing a direct connection between the 2 men. When investigators tracked down Kruger's current address, they found him living in a trailer park outside of Des Moines. The man who answered the door was clearly the same person described by the equipment rental witness, complete with the distinctive tattoos on his forearms. But 17 years had aged him dramatically. He appeared nervous, paranoid, and showed signs of long-term substance abuse. Initially, Kruger denied any involvement in the disappearance, but when confronted with the witness testimony and phone records showing multiple calls between his number and Webb's, his story began to crumble. After several hours of interrogation, he finally broke down and admitted his role in what he called the worst mistake of my life. According to Kruger, Webb had approached him in late 2003 with a proposition. Webb claimed to be working with a private research organization that was studying gifted children in controlled environments. He offered Kruger $50,000 in cash to help with what he described as a relocation project that would involve transporting a small group of children to a specialized facility. Kruger insisted that he had believed Webb's story about legitimate research. He claimed he had been told the children would be well cared for and that their families would be contacted once the study was complete. His job was simply to help with the transportation logistics and to ensure that no evidence of the operation remained behind. But as Kruger described the events of October 15, 2004, it became clear that he had been manipulated into participating in something far more sinister than he had realized. Webb had provided him with detailed instructions on how to intercept the school bus, redirect it to a predetermined location, and transfer the passengers to waiting vehicles. The plan had been executed with military precision. At exactly 9:55 a.m., just minutes after the bus had passed the final traffic camera, Kruger and his accomplices had used a fake police roadblock to stop the vehicle. They had told Carl Morrison, the driver, that there was a chemical spill ahead and that the bus needed to be rerouted through a back road for safety reasons. Morrison had complied without question, trusting what appeared to be legitimate law enforcement officers. He had followed their directions down a series of increasingly remote country roads until they reached an abandoned farm building where additional vehicles were waiting. It was there that the true horror of the operation had begun. According to Kruger, Webb had been waiting at the farm with several other men and a collection of specialized equipment. The children and their teacher had been removed from the bus, but not harmed. Webb had assured everyone that the subjects, as he called them, were simply being prepared for transport to the research facility. But Kruger's description of what happened next was fragmented and contradictory. He claimed that sedatives had been administered to keep the children calm during transport, but he insisted that no one had been hurt. He described loading the unconscious passengers into unmarked vans, but he couldn't or wouldn't say where those vehicles had taken them. When pressed for details about the research facility, Kruger became increasingly agitated. He claimed he had never seen the location himself, that his job had ended with the transportation phase of the operation. But investigators suspected he knew more than he was revealing, possibly because he was afraid of the consequences of telling the complete truth. The most disturbing part of Kruger's confession was his description of Webb's behavior during the operation. According to Kruger, Webb had been calm and professional throughout the entire process, treating the kidnapping as if it were a routine business transaction. He had taken extensive photographs and video footage of the children, documenting their condition and responses to the sedatives. Webb had also been meticulous about evidence cleanup. After the passengers had been transferred to the waiting vehicles, he had personally supervised the cleaning of the bus interior, removing any traces of the sedatives or the presence of the additional men. The bus had then been driven to the burial site, where it had been carefully positioned in a pre-dug hole and covered with earth. The burial itself had taken place over several nights, with work crews operating under cover of darkness to avoid detection. Kruger estimated that at least 6 people had been involved in the excavation and burial process, all of them following Webb's precise instructions. The operation had been planned down to the smallest detail, with contingency plans for every possible complication. But what haunted Kruger most was the memory of Webb's final words as the bus disappeared beneath the earth. According to Kruger, Webb had stood at the edge of the burial site and said, "Phase 3 complete. The subjects are now permanently archived. No one will ever find them where they've gone." The word "archived" sent chills through the investigation team. It suggested that the children weren't just being held somewhere. They were being preserved, documented, studied like specimens in some twisted research project. The implication was that Webb and his organization viewed the missing students not as human beings, but as valuable research materials to be cataloged and stored. Kruger's confession provided crucial details about the mechanics of the disappearance, but it raised even more disturbing questions about the ultimate fate of the missing children and their teacher. If Webb's organization had the resources to execute such an elaborate kidnapping and cover-up, what other capabilities did they possess? How many other children might have been taken? And most importantly, Were any of the Bus 47 passengers still alive somewhere, 17 years after their disappearance? The investigation team realized they were no longer dealing with a simple missing persons case. They were confronting what appeared to be an organized network of child traffickers operating with sophisticated resources and connections. The discovery of the buried bus had been just the beginning of a much larger and more terrifying conspiracy. As news of Kruger's confession spread through the law enforcement community, similar cases began to emerge from other jurisdictions. Reports of missing children with exceptional academic abilities, disappearances that had been written off as runaways or accidents, and unexplained gaps in school records from the early 2000s. The pattern suggested that Project Renaissance had been much larger than anyone had imagined. But for the families of the Bus 47 passengers, Kruger's confession brought both hope and despair. For the first time in 17 years, they had proof that their children had been taken by someone specific, for a specific purpose. The disappearance wasn't random, and it wasn't necessarily fatal. But the revelation that their children had been targeted as research subjects opened up possibilities too horrible to contemplate. The search for Dr. Marcus Webb intensified, with federal agencies joining the manhunt. His photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country, and his name was added to international watch lists. But Webb had had a 3-month head start, and he had demonstrated a talent for creating false identities and disappearing without a trace. Meanwhile, investigators began the painstaking process of tracking down every person who had been connected to Project Renaissance. The partially deleted files from Webb's computer contained fragments of names, addresses, and financial transactions that provided leads to follow. Each new discovery revealed another layer of the conspiracy, another person who had been involved in the systematic targeting and abduction of gifted children. The case that had begun with a simple school bus trip had evolved into one of the most complex and disturbing investigations in modern law enforcement history. And as the true scope of Project Renaissance began to emerge, investigators realized that the discovery of Bus 47 had been just the tip of an iceberg that extended far deeper into the darkness than anyone had dared to imagine. The investigation into Project Renaissance led authorities down a rabbit hole that seemed to have no bottom. Each new piece of evidence revealed connections to a network that had been operating in plain sight for years, using legitimate-sounding research programs and educational initiatives as cover for something far more sinister. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Webb hadn't been working alone in the school district. Financial records revealed payments to 3 other individuals who had been placed in strategic positions within the Cedar Falls educational system. A substitute teacher who had shown unusual interest in student records, a maintenance worker who had access to all buildings after hours, and most shocking of all, a member of the school board who had been voting on policies that affected gifted student programs. Each of these individuals had disappeared around the same time as Webb, their homes cleaned out and their bank accounts emptied. But they had left behind digital footprints that investigators were now following across state lines. Credit card transactions, cell phone records, and email communications painted a picture of a coordinated exodus that had been planned months in advance. The most chilling discovery came when forensic accountants traced the funding sources for Project Renaissance. The money hadn't come from any legitimate research institution or government agency. Instead, it had been funneled through a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts, ultimately leading back to a private organization called the Meridian Foundation. On paper, the Meridian Foundation appeared to be a legitimate nonprofit focused on advancing educational opportunities for gifted children. They had funded scholarships, sponsored academic competitions, and donated millions of dollars to schools across the Midwest. But investigators discovered that the foundation was actually a front for something called the Enhanced Learning Protocol, a classified program that had been studying the psychological and cognitive development of exceptional children. The Enhanced Learning Protocol had been operating since the late 1990s, using the Meridian Foundation as a cover to gain access to school districts and identify potential subjects for their research. They had developed sophisticated screening methods to identify children with specific cognitive abilities, psychological profiles, and family situations that made them ideal candidates for their studies. But what exactly were they studying? The answer came from a former Meridian Foundation employee who had been haunted by her involvement in the program for over 2 decades. Dr. Sarah Mills had worked as a psychological evaluator for the foundation from 1999 to 2006, administering tests and assessments to thousands of children across multiple states. Dr. Mills revealed that the Enhanced Learning Protocol was attempting to create what they called cognitive enhancement in gifted children. The program was based on the theory that exceptional children could be trained to develop abilities far beyond normal human limitations through a combination of psychological conditioning, pharmaceutical intervention, and environmental manipulation. The children who were selected for the program were told they were participating in advanced educational opportunities. They were taken to remote facilities that looked like boarding schools or summer camps, where they underwent intensive training designed to expand their cognitive abilities. The training methods included sensory deprivation, pharmaceutical experiments, and psychological conditioning that bordered on torture. According to Dr. Mills, the program had achieved some success in enhancing certain cognitive abilities in their subjects. Children who had been through the Enhanced Learning Protocol had demonstrated remarkable improvements in memory, pattern recognition, and problem-solving skills. But the psychological cost had been devastating. Many of the children had suffered permanent mental trauma, and some had experienced complete psychological breakdowns. The most disturbing revelation was that the program had been designed to be irreversible. Once children entered the Enhanced Learning Protocol, they were never allowed to leave. The psychological conditioning made them completely dependent on their handlers, unable to function in normal society. They became, in effect, human computers programmed to serve the needs of the organization. Dr. Mills's testimony provided the missing piece of the puzzle. The 12 students from Bus 47 hadn't been kidnapped for ransom or killed in some tragic accident. They had been selected as subjects for the Enhanced Learning Protocol, their exceptional abilities making them ideal candidates for cognitive enhancement experiments. The realization that the missing children were likely still alive somewhere, but had been transformed into something unrecognizable, was almost more horrible than the possibility that they had died. Their families were forced to confront the idea that their children might still exist, but in a form that would be psychologically and emotionally destroyed. The investigation team launched a massive effort to locate the facilities where the Enhanced Learning Protocol was being conducted. They cross-referenced property records, utility usage patterns, and satellite imagery to identify locations that might be housing the missing children. The search focused on remote areas with minimal outside contact, places where unusual activities could be conducted without attracting attention. The first facility was discovered in a converted military base in rural Montana. When federal agents raided the location, they found evidence of the Enhanced Learning Protocol's activities, including specialized equipment, pharmaceutical supplies, and detailed records of experiments conducted on dozens of children over the past 2 decades. But the facility was empty. The program had been shut down and evacuated months earlier, around the same time that Webb and his associates had disappeared from Cedar Falls. The timing suggested that the organization had been aware of the impending discovery of Bus 47 and had taken steps to protect their operations. However, the Montana facility provided crucial intelligence about the scope and structure of the Enhanced Learning Protocol. Computer servers contained encrypted files with records of hundreds of children who had been processed through the program over the years. The files included psychological profiles, experimental data, and status reports that painted a horrifying picture of systematic child abuse disguised as scientific research. Among the encrypted files, investigators found records for all 12 of the missing Bus 47 students. The files confirmed that they had been transported to the Montana facility in October 2004, where they had undergone the initial phases of the Enhanced Learning Protocol. The records showed that all 12 children had survived the initial conditioning process and had been classified as high-value subjects, suitable for advanced protocols. But the trail went cold after 2018. The files showed that the Bus 47 subjects had been transferred to what was described as a secure continuation facility for the final phases of their enhancement. The location of this facility wasn't specified in the Montana records, but references to Project Culmination suggested that it was where the program's most successful subjects were taken for permanent integration. The discovery of the Montana facility sparked a nationwide manhunt for other enhanced learning protocol locations. Federal agencies coordinated with international law enforcement to track down members of the organization who had fled the country. The investigation had become a race against time to find the missing children before they could be moved again, or worse, before the organization decided to eliminate the evidence of their crimes. Meanwhile, the families of the Bus 47 passengers were struggling to process the revelation that their children had been subjected to years of psychological experimentation. The knowledge that their sons and daughters might still be alive somewhere was both a source of hope and a crushing burden. If the children were found, would they even remember their families? Would they be capable of returning to normal life after years of conditioning? The investigation team worked around the clock, following every lead and analyzing every piece of evidence from the Montana facility. They discovered that the Enhanced Learning Protocol had been funded by a combination of private investors and government contracts, suggesting that the program had official backing at some level. The government connections were particularly disturbing. The Enhanced Learning Protocol appeared to have been developed as part of a classified research program aimed at creating enhanced human intelligence for national security purposes. The program had been outsourced to the Meridian Foundation to maintain plausible deniability, but it had been guided by government objectives and funded through black budget appropriations. As the investigation expanded, more facilities were discovered across the country. Each one told the same story. Gifted children had been systematically identified, abducted, and subjected to experimental procedures designed to enhance their cognitive abilities. The scale of the operation was staggering, with evidence suggesting that hundreds of children had been processed through the program over 2 decades. But the Enhanced Learning Protocol's subjects remained elusive. Each facility that was discovered had been evacuated before investigators arrived, suggesting that the organization had sophisticated intelligence capabilities and advance warning of law enforcement activities. The children who had been held at these facilities had been moved to unknown locations, their current status and condition uncertain. The breakthrough in finding the missing children